I never imagined that raindrops could become a weapon. But that was before Karen moved in 2 houses down, before she appointed herself Supreme Commander of the Neighborhood Weather Enforcement Committee, and before she marched up to my door waving a clipboard like it was a holy relic. The first time I saw her, she was shouting at clouds, demanding they stop hovering over her begonias. I thought it was a joke. Turns out, the universe was sharpening its sense of humor at my expense. The whole ridiculous saga began on a Tuesday morning when the sky was gray and drizzling lightly, the kind of rain that just politely reminds you nature exists. I was inside, making coffee and congratulating myself for finally installing rain barrels by my back fence. It felt responsible, sustainable, and honestly kind of cool to say I was harvesting rainwater. That's when someone pounded on my front door like they were trying to escape a zombie horde. It was Karen. High-waisted khakis, plastic visor, lipstick applied with military precision, and that clipboard clutched like she'd earned it in combat. Without saying hello, she announced that she was with the Homeowners Association Compliance Task Force, which sounded like a long way of saying she was bored and needed a hobby. She informed me that collecting rainwater was a violation of our local HOA guidelines because the rain belonged to the common environment and therefore was a shared resource. I blinked at her, waiting for a punchline. There wasn't one. She handed me a notice that said I had 48 hours to remove my rain barrels or face fines. Actual fines. For rain. I pointed out that the HOA never mentioned rain barrels in any documents we received when we bought the home. She smiled a tight, smug, lipless smile and said the bylaws had recently been updated. She emphasized, recently, like she personally rewrote them while laughing in a thunderstorm. I tried being diplomatic. I told her I'd reach out to the HOA president and get clarification before I changed anything. She said I was welcome to do that, but she'd already reported my violation and the fines would start if I didn't comply immediately. Then she spun on her heel, marching away like a tiny, furious general. I stared after her, stunned. I thought that was the end of the madness. Spoiler, it was just the overture. Later that afternoon, I emailed the HOA president, who was surprisingly reasonable. He said he had no idea what Karen was talking about and that there was no rainwater rule. He promised to speak with her. I figured that would resolve it. Instead, Karen escalated. The next day, I woke up to find bright orange water theft alert posters taped to my garage door and mailbox. Actual posters. In bold letters. With terrible clip art of a cartoon villain stealing water in a bucket. My coffee went cold in my hand. At first, I thought maybe kids were pranking me, but then I saw Karen standing at the end of my driveway, arms folded, monitoring my reaction like she was studying wildlife. I asked her what the hell this was. She said she was documenting community hazards, and as long as I continued my criminal rain harvesting operation, she would ensure the neighborhood stayed informed. The sheer absurdity lit a spark inside me. I wasn't going to be bullied over weather. I removed the posters, kept my rain barrels in place, and went to work. When I came home, Karen had escalated again. She placed a large environmental threat sign by the curb and installed a cheap plastic camera pointing at my gutters. She stood there proudly, as if this surveillance initiative would earn her a medal from the governor. I could have chosen peace. I could have ignored her. But there is something primal that awakens when confronted with someone who truly believes they have authority they do not possess. She thought she could scare me into obedience. Instead, she created a hobby for me, proving her wrong. I documented everything. Every poster, every conversation, every ridiculous new stunt she tried. I sent it all to the HOA board. They were not amused. Meanwhile, Karen's frustration grew. She left another notice, this time claiming my gutters were illegally directing runoff onto communal soil. That phrase alone told me she had spent her entire evening Googling laws she didn't understand. I walked out to my lawn while she was busy taping a new poster to a tree. I told her calmly that the HOA president confirmed there were no rules against rain barrels. She accused me of lying. I suggested she call him. She said she already did and he was misinformed. That's when I realized the truth. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. Karen believed she was the rules. Her crusade intensified. She followed the mailman, telling him to note my address for future federal review. She photographed my driveway whenever it was wet, claiming she was gathering evidence. She even stood outside during storms with a giant umbrella, glaring at my roof like it was personally disrespecting her. The moment that defined the turning point came on Thursday morning. I caught her peeking over my back fence, camera out, documenting how much water dripped from my gutters. I stepped outside, asking what she thought she was doing. She said she was measuring my unlawful accumulation of shared precipitation. My response was simple. If she wanted to go to war over rainwater, she'd better be waterproof. Inside, I brewed coffee and sat down with a notebook. If Karen wanted a spectacle, I would give her a monsoon. I just had to wait for the perfect storm, literally and figuratively. The weather forecast said Saturday would bring heavy rain, the kind that floods gutters and turns lawns into mud pit. That would be my moment. I spent the next 2 days preparing. She had escalated. Now I would escalate smarter. By Friday evening, every neighbor was aware of her antics. Some avoided eye contact when they saw her coming, others laughed behind closed curtains, but no one dared challenge her. I realized she thrived on the belief that nobody would push back. That was her fuel. Take that away, and she would sputter like a cheap lawn mower in wet grass. I walked the yard that night, the drizzle soft on my shoulders, and planned angles, hoses, downspouts, and gravity. Karen thought she alone understood the rules of nature, that she alone could define where water was allowed to roam. But nature has a simple rule: water flows downhill. She was the lowest point. Saturday morning came with thunder rumbling in the distance, a promise building in the sky. I saw Karen already outside in her raincoat, patrol stance activated, clipboard ready. She looked like she expected me to break. Instead, I greeted her cheerfully, which only seemed to increase her suspicion. Anxiety flickered in her eyes. Maybe she sensed I wasn't just enduring anymore. I was anticipating. And nothing unsettles a tyrant more than a calm opponent ready to smile through a storm. The raindrops were the beginning of the spectacle ahead. The first raindrops smacked against my gutters like a drummer warming up. Karen immediately sprang into action, stepping into the street with her clipboard and camera, already documenting non-existent crimes. The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't so aggressively stupid. But I wasn't watching her. I was watching the gutters. And the rain was gaining momentum. For years, those gutters had dutifully guided rainwater into an underground drainage pipe that fed into my backyard. But that was before Karen declared war on physics. Yesterday, I'd spent hours in the garage, modifying the system. A simple but brilliant adjustment, redirectable downspouts. Nothing illegal. Nothing that violated any rule. Just creatively positioned. And currently, they were aimed directly toward a low patch of grass on the fence line. A patch that happened to sit slightly higher on my side than hers. Meaning, eventually, water would seek the lower ground. Meaning, eventually, gravity would do what gravity does. Still, I wasn't ready to deploy the ultimate move yet. First, Karen had to overplay her hand. The rain picked up, transitioning from drizzle to sheets of water. My driveway darkened into a shimmer. Karen, soaked despite her neon raincoat, marched straight up to my porch without knocking. She yelled through the glass that she was issuing an emergency environmental citation. Emergency. For rain. I opened the door slowly, enjoying her growing frustration as she held up the paper triumphantly, like she was Moses presenting commandments. She said she had documented clear evidence that my gutters were not dispersing water fairly and that the HOA had authorized immediate penalties. The HOA had done no such thing. I knew because 5 minutes earlier I received an email from the president apologizing again for Karen's behavior and assuring me they'd handle it soon. But as Karen lectured me, I heard her own gutters gurgling loudly. Her downspouts were rattling under the flow. I glanced behind her. Her lawn was already glistening and uneven, puddles forming. Her camera clicked with frantic aggression as she pointed it toward my roof. She said she would deliver this photographic evidence to local authorities if necessary. I asked her what crime she thought Rain committed. She said, water misappropriation, with total sincerity. At that point, any lingering sympathy I had evaporated into the stormy air. I let her finish her speech. When she concluded with a dramatic warning that legal consequences would be severe, I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind that says, I have receipts, I have patience, and I have time. I asked if she was sure she wanted to keep pushing this. She replied that community safety required difficult decisions. The exact moment she turned to leave, a sudden gust blew sideways and slapped her with a wave of gutter overflow from her own house. She shrieked like she'd been attacked by a dolphin. And the storm was still warming up. I returned inside, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and observed from the window as Karen sprinted awkwardly toward the back of her house to inspect the damage. I envisioned what she would find: water collecting near her basement windows, forming a cold moat around the fortress she believed she ruled. I wasn't done yet, because I wasn't the one creating the water. I simply planned to avoid being its final destination. Around noon, the thunder cracked open the clouds and unleashed a downpour that sounded like marbles pelting metal. The gutters groaned. And that's when I put Phase 1 into action. I pulled a small level from my pocket, stepped outside, and gently nudged the extension of my downspout a precise fraction of an inch. Water that once drained harmlessly into my garden now surged along the fence, straight toward Karen's pristine lawn. But again, gravity was the real mastermind. Water took one sniff at her slight yard slope and decided downhill was tasty. Within minutes, Karen's grass was a shallow river. I watched her pacing back and forth, trying to block water with a rake like some kind of suburban Poseidon. She slipped, nearly face-planting. Meanwhile, I turned and gave a friendly wave. She didn't wave back. She stomped over to me yet again, splashing mud with each furious step. She screamed that what I was doing was intentional flooding. I replied that I was merely redirecting my own lawful precipitation runoff into my own yard. I emphasized lawful. She sputtered that it wasn't staying in my yard. I raised one eyebrow and said, "Gravity is a harsh mistress." The look she gave me suggested she wished she could outlaw gravity. That's when her husband, the rarely seen Bob, emerged. Bob always looked like he regretted every decision that had led him to this precise moment in the universe. His expression was 80% sigh, 20% dread. He took one look at the situation, shook his head, and disappeared back inside. Smart man. Karen demanded that I angle my gutters away from her yard immediately. I said I'd be more than happy to comply as soon as she provided written confirmation from the HOA that my rain barrels were fully approved and that all fines and citations she issued were rescinded. That's when she snapped. She accused me of blackmailing her with water. I shrugged and corrected her. Leverage, Karen. The word you're looking for is leverage. Her eyes widened like she'd never encountered someone who refused to bow to her clipboard-fueled authority. She yelled that she'd call the police. I told her to go ahead. I'd already recorded every absurd thing she'd done. She reminded me that she had photographic evidence too. I reminded her that photographic evidence of rain is not usually compelling in court. Then the storm reached peak power. Lightning flashed. The street transformed into a small canal. Water rushed harder across the property line, accelerating as the slope increased. Karen ran toward her back door, slipping again. When she reached her patio, she froze. Her French drain was overwhelmed. The water was rising, creeping closer and closer to her basement steps. The color drained from her face faster than the rain could fill her yard. I watched her panic and, for a brief moment, almost considered helping. Almost. But then I remembered every poster, every threat, every moment she acted as though she owned me. So instead, I called out through the storm that this was her chance to do the right thing. All she had to do was admit she was wrong, rescind the citations, and stop harassing me. She didn't answer. Instead, she scrambled to lift outdoor furniture in a chaotic frenzy. Desperation replaced arrogance. She slipped again, falling into a muddy puddle. Her camera went flying into the water, where it died a tragic but deserved death. She screamed in fury at the sky, at the water, at everything that dared defy her imagined control. The HOA president arrived right as Karen launched into an accusation so incoherent that even the wind ignored it. He took one look at her swamp of a yard, then at my calm presence under my porch, and asked for an explanation. She shrieked that I had weaponized weather. He stared at her like he wasn't sure she was real. Before she could escalate further, I simply said I would be happy to comply with any HOA rules once they confirmed there are any. The president told Karen firmly that she had no authority to issue citations or update bylaws on her own. His tone was blistering. Karen's jaw dropped like someone had unplugged her brain. He instructed me to continue water collection if I pleased and assured me the board would draft an official statement to prevent further harassment. Karen tried to interrupt, but he shut her down and told her to go inside and stay dry. Her retreat was the sweetest surrender I'd ever seen. As she sloshed home, drenched and defeated, I redirected the gutters back toward my garden. The rain softened. The storm began to pass. But I knew Karen wasn't done. She wasn't a quitter. She was a simmerer, someone who would stew silently until the next spark reignited her crusade. And I could already see it in her soaked glare. Next time, she wouldn't go after just my rain barrels. She would go after me. And that was fine, because I was just getting started. Karen didn't bounce back immediately. For 2 full days, the neighborhood enjoyed silence. No posters, no citations, no cloud harassment patrols. Her soggy yard gradually recovered, her camera remained dead, and her pride tried to resurrect itself like a vengeful ghost. I assumed the storm dampened her appetite for control. But that was optimistic thinking. Karen didn't retreat to reflect. She retreated to plot. Wednesday morning delivered the first clue. A freshly printed flyer appeared on every door except mine. Neighbors sent me photos. The headline, "Beware the Water Hoarder." She tried to rebrand me as a villain who endangered children and pets by manipulating dangerous environmental shifts. One paragraph accused me of draining the neighborhood ecosystem. Another claimed my suspicious infrastructure modifications were a threat to home values. She made me sound like a Bond villain with a hose. Most neighbors found it hilarious. A few rolled their eyes and tossed the flyers. But Karen didn't care about their reactions. She wanted fear, control, compliance. If she couldn't force me to move my gutters, she'd manipulate the crowd to do it for her. Power redistributed through gossip. By lunchtime, the HOA president emailed me again, this time sounding embarrassed and exhausted. He assured me they were drafting a formal reprimand for Karen. I thanked him, but I wasn't worried. Karen's attempts at public shame were only making her look unhinged. Still, I knew she wasn't finished. Karen's crusades always escalated. She needed to win. The rainstorm might have bruised her ego, but now she'd try strategy. Thursday morning, that strategy arrived wearing a neon vest. I came outside to find a city utility truck parked at my curb. 2 workers inspected my water meter and the drainage pipe that bordered my backyard. Karen stood nearby with the posture of someone giving a TED Talk. She pointed at my home repeatedly, narrating what she believed were my crimes. When she noticed me, she waved her clipboard triumphantly as though this was checkmate. I walked over calmly. One worker explained they received a report of illegal water diversion into public property. Illegal diversion, not illegal rain. Karen had finally done some research. Or rather, she misunderstood something she Googled and made it worse. The workers inspected my yard, checked the drainage, and asked a few questions. My modifications were fully legal. The water flowed exactly where it was supposed to. No violation. As they left, Karen demanded to see their paperwork, citing Citizen Oversight Authority. They ignored her. She screamed at them until she lost her voice. When she turned that horse fury toward me, I just sipped my coffee and waved. She stomped back inside, soaked in a fresh wave of humiliation. But something changed that afternoon. Her blinds snapped shut. No more pacing the sidewalk. No more shouting. Silence made me uneasy. It meant she wasn't reacting anymore. She was planning something bigger. By Friday morning, I learned what that something was. I stepped onto my porch and froze. My rain barrels were gone. Stolen. Every single one. Cut from their attachments and dragged away. The boldness wasn't shocking. The stupidity was. She didn't even hide the evidence. A muddy trail led directly to her backyard gate. It was practically a confession in breadcrumb form. I took photos from every angle. The saw marks. The drag lines. The exact direction of the trail. I emailed the HOA, the city, and for additional satisfaction, the non-emergency police line. I wasn't angry. I was impressed. It takes a special kind of entitlement to steal someone's property to enforce imaginary rules. Less than an hour later, a police cruiser arrived. 2 officers knocked on her door. I watched as they questioned her. She denied everything, but her performance lacked confidence. Her hands shook. Her eyes darted. They asked to check her backyard. She refused. They insisted. She caved. My rain barrels sat in a sloppy pile behind her shed, scratched and dented. Karen tried to spin a story about protecting the neighborhood. The officers weren't amused. They made her drag every single barrel back to my yard under supervision. My role? I supervised with a pleasant smile. Her face as she hauled stolen property through soaking mud belonged in a museum dedicated to karma. She wheezed and muttered curses under her breath. When the last barrel thudded onto my lawn, the officers warned her clearly. One more act of harassment, vandalism, or trespassing would result in charges. Karen didn't cry. She simmered, silent, trembling rage. Tears would at least suggest vulnerability. Simmering meant revenge was fermenting. After the officers left, she spun and hissed that she wouldn't tolerate water chaos. I replied that chaos was subjective, but theft was fairly objective. She retreated with a furious stomp. That night, the street lights flickered on. I stood in the yard, checking the gutters for debris. The air was still, the sky clear. But I felt tension, like static rising before a lightning strike. Karen's upstairs light stayed on late. I imagined her pacing with a fresh stack of printed bylaws, self-written, of course. Saturday morning brought sunshine, something new to fight about. Karen emerged carrying a clipboard and a new homemade sign. She posted it at the edge of the neighborhood park. Protect our water, ban rain barrels. Beneath it, she pushed a small plastic donation jar labeled Legal Fund. Legal Fund. For a war against precipitation. Neighbors laugh. A few teenagers filmed TikTok videos mocking the sign. One kid asked if donating would stop the clouds. Karen shouted that this was a serious cause. The kid responded by dropping in 3 Monopoly bills and running away. Karen ripped down her own jar in frustration. Later that afternoon, the HOA president arrived with a stack of official documents. He called a mandatory emergency meeting. Everyone gathered on the street. Karen stood proudly, assuming this was her moment of triumph, her time to shine. But the president read a detailed statement that made her smile dissolve like sugar in boiling water. Effective immediately, Karen was removed from all HOA committees. Her authority to issue notices was revoked. Any future attempts to enforce non-existent rules would be treated as harassment. And she must cease all contact with me unless mediated by the board. Neighbors applauded. Some cheered. A few recorded the announcement like it was the finale of a reality show. Karen looked physically ill. Her power evaporated in the sun. She tried to interrupt, claiming the board was ignoring a crisis. The president shut her down in front of everyone. She stormed inside, slamming her door hard enough that a nearby squirrel jumped. Victory tasted sweet. But I knew one truth. People like Karen don't accept consequences. They don't self-reflect. They reroute. And I was right. The next morning, I discovered my drainage pipe clogged with expanding foam. My gutter extensions ripped off and tossed behind my shed. It wasn't even subtle. She wanted me to know it was her. And this time, she didn't just want to inconvenience me. She wanted to destroy my home. I unclogged the pipe, documented the damage, and realized something important. The war was no longer about rain. It was about principle. Karen believed she was the guardian of order, the chosen defender of property lines and moral superiority. She thought she could break me. But all she did was give me a new idea. A bigger idea. One that would remind her exactly what water can do when pushed too far. I learned something important while clearing foam from my drainage system. Karen was committed. The kind of committed that makes people duct tape their windows before a storm, or argue with squirrels about property lines. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't scared of HOA votes, police warnings, or common sense. She was threatened. And threatened people take risks. So I decided to take one too. Not illegal. Not destructive. Just a clever application of the same rule she tried to use against me. Water flows downhill. And Karen's entire backyard sat one smooth downward slide away from mine. The idea came quietly at first, while I was elbow-deep in pipe grime. But the brilliance of it grew the drier I became. If Karen wanted a war over gutters, she would get a masterclass. Saturday night, I visited the hardware store. A few connectors. Some flexible tubing. A couple new tools. Nothing suspicious. Nothing she could report, unless wanting to avoid property damage suddenly became a felony. Back home, I waited until the neighborhood went to sleep. Even Bob's truck was gone, likely fleeing for emotional safety. Under the soft glow of a motion light, I worked. The adjustments were subtle. A small rerouting valve here. A calibrated tilt there. A cleverly buried extension that reconnected to a forgotten section of old pipe that ran exactly where I needed it to. Into the space behind Karen's new fence, where rain puddles already gathered like party guests waiting for a DJ. When it was finished, the setup looked normal. Legal. Ordinary. But with one twist, one tiny shift in flow direction, that would make a dramatic, gravity-fueled difference the next time clouds decided to get emotional. I slept easily that night, dreaming of thunderstorms. Morning brought clear skies, and with them, the calm before escalation. Karen, however, was not calm. She was rebuilding, reinventing, reinforcing her yard like a suburban medieval fortress. She installed flimsy plastic borders along the property line. She shoveled gravel into damp areas. She even planted little flags to mark the flood zones, like some kind of hydrocartographer. She wasn't preparing for war. She believed she already won. That I would eventually grow tired and surrender. That the water would yield to her persistence. But you can't negotiate with physics. Still, I didn't rush the next move. Revenge is like rain. It's best when it builds uncomfortably slowly, drop by drop, until someone realizes too late they should have bought better drainage. 2 days passed without clouds. Karen remained hyper-alert. Every time I stepped outside, she stared, watching my gutters like a security guard assigned to a particularly suspicious roof. Her obsession deepened until she barely blinked. I half expected her to start interviewing Raindrops for criminal intent. Then Wednesday arrived. Clouds thick and swollen rolled across the sky. A storm advisory chimed on my phone. Lightning flickered somewhere distant. I smiled like someone who bought popcorn for opening night. Karen noticed too. She paced her yard, tightening her raincoat strings. She set up buckets beneath my gutter line, believing she could capture the evidence of runoff theft she needed to finally destroy me. She wasn't preparing her home. She was staging her accusation. The first thunderclap made her flinch. Rain burst from the clouds like a faucet turned to maximum. My gutters filled instantly, roaring with purpose. I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee, my newest form of psychological warfare, and watched the spectacle unfold. The water shot down my new extensions and entered the buried line. Karen noticed immediately. Her head snapped toward my yard, eyes wide with suspicion and dread. She ran to the fence, trying to peer over, but she was too short to see the truth. The truth was rushing beneath her, gathering, rising, spreading across every inch of her perfectly maintained lawn with unstoppable enthusiasm. Within minutes, puddles formed into pools and pools grew into miniature lakes. Her terracotta planters floated like sad little boats. Mud splashed up onto her white vinyl siding. It was beautiful. Karen screamed, a high-pitched alarm only dogs and bitter souls could hear. She grabbed bags of mulch and tried building a makeshift dam. The water responded the way water always does. It laughed and flowed around the obstacles. She ran for Bob, yelling for help. Bob emerged wearing slippers, took one look at the chaos, and muttered a sentence that elevated him instantly into the hall of marriage honesty. Just apologize to him. Karen gasped like he had suggested cannibalism. Apologize? Admit defeat? Recognize someone else's rights? She chose war. She charged directly at me through the rainstorm, hair plastered to her face like angry seaweed. She yelled that I was intentionally flooding her yard again, and that this time she would make sure I went to jail. Jail for understanding basic slope physics. I replied calmly, letting each word cut precisely. I'm not flooding anything. My gutters drain into my yard. Your yard is simply lower. Gravity isn't a crime. She tried to shout over the storm, but the thunder swallowed her words. I could tell she wanted to spit accusations, but reality hit her like a cold wave. There were no cops rushing in. No HOA backup. No neighbors rallying behind her. Everyone was watching from their porches, phones out, recording her meltdown for posterity and probably TikTok. And the water kept rising. It didn't stop until it reached the very bottom lip of her basement window well. A single inch higher and she'd have an indoor pool she never wanted. Bob ran to set up pumps while Karen circled helplessly, slipping, sliding, and screaming at clouds like they had personal vendettas. The storm eventually slowed, but the damage was done. The yard was ruined. Landscaping destroyed. Tools and decorations buried in muck. Karen stood shivering in soaked khakis, staring into the abyss of consequences. Bob approached me quietly through the drizzle. He didn't defend her. He didn't threaten me. He asked a single exhausted question: what will it take for this to end? For the first time, I saw the real casualty of Karen's battles. It wasn't me. It was him. A man who wanted peace and mistakenly married a natural disaster with a clipboard. I told him the truth. All I wanted was to be left alone. No more harassment. No more fake rules. No more property invasion. He nodded solemnly and promised he would handle it. That night, for the first time since she began her war on water, Karen didn't come outside. But silence doesn't always mean surrender. Around midnight, exhausted but awake, I noticed a glow in the backyard. A flashlight beam cutting across my garden. Footsteps squelching through mud. Figures moving in shadows. Karen wasn't alone. She had reinforcements, and this time they weren't armed with clipboards. They were carrying shovels. It is one thing to fight a tyrant who acts alone. It is another to wake up and discover that tyrant has recruited a militia. The flashlight beams danced in my backyard like invading soldiers, sweeping every inch of lawn and garden bed, as if they expected to uncover a secret underground reservoir. I stood silently at my upstairs window, watching as Karen barked quiet orders like a general in muddy slippers. The helpers moved in groups of 2, carrying shovels and long plastic trenching tools. There were 3 of them besides Karen. A wiry neighbor named Doug who collected conspiracy theories like baseball cards, a retiree named Sharon who believed every HOA rumor was gospel, and a guy I had never seen before but who looked like he regretted his life choices almost instantly. Each step they took produced a wet squelch, an unpleasant sound that perfectly matched their intentions. They weren't just scouting. They were preparing. Karen wasn't trying to block rain anymore. She wanted to alter the battlefield entirely. I slipped downstairs and opened my back door just as they reached my fence. Their flashlights froze on me like spotlights. Karen was the first to recover her voice. She hissed that she knew exactly what I was doing and that she would not let me weaponize rain again. I told her I had done nothing illegal, and certainly nothing at midnight. She spat that legality was irrelevant when community safety was at risk, a phrase that sounded suspiciously like a dictator's motto. Doug lifted his shovel higher. Sharon clutched her rake like it was a crucifix warding off a hydrologist. The new guy simply mouthed an apology in my direction, barely audible over the storm-soaked ground. I calmly asked what they planned to do. Karen said they were digging a diversion trench on her property to stop what she called my water assault. I pointed out that the trench clearly crossed the property line onto my side. She countered that property lines were flexible when public good was involved. That one sentence would have been laughable if it wasn't paired with the sound of metal cutting into my soil. The first shovel strike hit like a personal insult. Dirt flew. Water splashed. They advanced another foot, determined and sloppy. I told them to stop. Karen said they would stop once the trench was deep enough to redirect stormwater away from her yard forever. Forever was her favorite time span, right after immediately. When I stepped closer, Doug tightened his grip on the shovel like he expected me to launch a physical attack, which was absurd. The only thing I wanted to hit was his logic, but there wasn't much to strike. I took a deep breath. I reminded Karen about the police warning. She responded that rainwater emergencies required decisive action. I told her she was trespassing. She claimed she was performing preventative maintenance on shared land. I asked her to define shared land. She pointed vaguely at a puddle. I told her I was calling the police. She dared me. So I did. The operator recognized my voice before I finished the sentence. She asked if this was another rain dispute. I confirmed it was. Her exhausted sigh carried across the phone lines like thunder. Officers were dispatched. I returned outside and waited, arms crossed, raincoat zipped, watching as Karen and her band of midnight landscapers dug deeper into their delusions. When the police arrived, headlights illuminated the secret trench project with theatrical brilliance. The officers stepped out slowly, and the look on their faces said they had practiced patience for this exact group. Karen rushed toward them, dripping and frantic, spinning a tale about crisis and climate control like she was auditioning for a disaster documentary. The officers asked for proof I was causing harm. She gestured wildly at mud, physics, and her imagination. One officer asked if she had permission to dig on my property. She insisted no permission was needed because she acted for everyone. The second officer asked the ridiculous but legally required question: did she believe she had the authority to alter my land? She responded that she didn't believe she knew. That sentence sealed her fate. The officers told them to put down the tools. Doug complied instantly, relieved to surrender. Sharon hesitated, eyes darting between her Rain Crusader captain and the badged agents of reality. The stranger dropped his shovel and apologized again. Karen, however, held onto her trenching tool like it was the torch of freedom. One officer stepped closer and calmly repeated the command. Karen released the tool dramatically, like she was sacrificing herself to protect a greater cause. She tried to gather her dignity as the officers explained trespassing laws. Her chin trembled with outrage as she insisted gravity was the criminal here, not her. They issued her a final, last-chance warning. One more incident. Just one. And she would be arrested. They also insisted the trench be filled immediately. Doug and the apologetic stranger got to work with their hands, pushing dirt back into the sloppy wound they'd cut into the yard. Sharon helped half-heartedly. Karen stared dead ahead, jaw clenched so tight her teeth probably begged for mercy. When the police left, I thanked them, then returned inside. The adrenaline wore off quickly. Exhaustion hit me like a weighted blanket. This wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't clever. It wasn't even satisfying. It was a ridiculous cycle of retaliation that had transformed a calm neighborhood into a battleground. The next morning brought sun, steam rising from the soaked earth. I walked outside with fresh determination to replace the damaged extension pieces. Karen wasn't visible. Neither was Bob. Their blinds were closed tight, like they were barricaded behind them. I could almost feel the tension vibrating through the suburban quiet. My mind jumped between fight and flight. Did I really want to keep escalating? Was the victory worth the cost? Could a single person really justify such intensity over gutters and rain? The rational voice in me whispered that it was over. She had been warned into silence. The storm had passed. Peace was possible. That whisper vanished when I reached the fence. Someone had uprooted the gutter extensions again and snapped one in half. Muddy footprints led directly back toward Karen's yard. I stared at the evidence, a sinking feeling replacing all triumph. She didn't care about warnings. She didn't care about legality. She cared about control. If she had to lose the neighborhood to win the fight, she would. A cold realization settled into my bones. I had tried boundaries. I had tried law. I had tried logic. None of it mattered. But there was one thing I hadn't tried. Not compliance. Not retreat. Something stronger, cleaner, unstoppable. I looked up at the roofs along the street. I looked at the slope of the land. I looked at the sky, already darkening again with the promise of more weather. The pattern revealed itself like a map in my mind. Every downspout on the block moved water downhill. And the lowest backyard wasn't mine. It was hers. I stared at the snapped pieces of my drainage system and felt a strange calm spread through me. She showed me the rules she lived by. Whoever directs water wins. Fine. If Karen wanted a war of runoff, I would bring her a flood she would never forget. By the time the city inspector issued the citations, the fight had stopped being funny. It had become a ledger of behavior. Dates, photos, police reports, statements from neighbors who were tired of living in a drama. I spent an afternoon compiling everything into a neat packet, digital copies on a thumb drive, printed pages in a binder, a timeline that left no room for the fog of Karen's rhetoric. It was ridiculously prosaic work, but effective. Paper is a kind of honesty that sarcasm cannot beat. When officials arrived, they didn't care about the moral theater. They cared about property lines and codes. They made notes, measured grades, and shook their heads at the foam clogging my drainage. They handed Karen a list of remediation tasks and a citation for trespass and theft after the stolen barrels were documented. The HOA followed with sanctions. It wasn't theatrical revenge. It was bureaucracy doing what it was designed to do, enforce rules and assign responsibility. It was quieter than I had fantasized, but more permanent. The neighborhood watched with a mixture of schadenfreude and relief. Doug, who had been dragged into the middle of the mess, posted a clumsy apology online that felt like a surrender to embarrassment. Sharon stopped coming out with flyers and started coming over with casseroles, which is to say life resumed its odd, imperfect rhythms. Bob, who had been the quiet victim of his wife's crusade, began to talk to me like a neighbor again, apologizing for the trouble and promising the kind of small amends that make things functional instead of theatrical. Small amends are boring until you realize they rebuild everything. There were practical reparations, too. The HOA required Karen to pay restitution for the stolen and damaged barrels. The city required a landscaping plan to correct the grade around her basement and to install proper drainage. She grumbled, fumed, and threatened appeals she could not afford. In court-like fashion, she learned a deceptively simple lesson. Enthusiasm without knowledge is expensive. She responded first with fury, then with a strange, defensive silence. The flyers and nighttime trenches stopped. The late-night raids on my watering system ceased. The only thing she continued to attempt was moral superiority, which is harder to fine or order to remove. But even that dimmed when neighbors stopped responding. It turns out moral superiority requires an audience. I could have escalated. There was a ready audience online, and a stack of footage that would have made a delicious, outraged viral post. But I didn't. I had spent months waiting for the dramatic apex and found, in the end, that the quiet resolution felt better. I wanted the nights without posters on my garage, not fame for being right. So I pushed for mediation. The HOA brokered a series of sessions, formal, uncomfortable, and surprisingly productive. Under supervision, Karen admitted small things. Not an oration of contrition, but tiny acknowledgments that fit onto forms and into minutes. We asked the city to require a shared solution, a rain garden planted along the low point between our yards that would absorb overflow and create a buffer. It was municipal enough to feel official and local enough to be useful. Karen agreed, not because she loved the idea, but because it checked boxes on the remediation plan. We planted sedges and native shrubs that week, plants with deep roots and a taste for water. Every shovelful of soil felt like a small truce. The work changed things in tiny but meaningful ways. Bob began showing up for community garden days. Doug mowed my lawn on Saturdays and, in exchange, I taught him how a proper downspout extender works, which is to say I taught him to be useful instead of performative. Sharon baked apple pies and left one on my porch every month like a bizarre olive branch ritual. Community chatter shifted from conspiracies about water hoarding to harmless gossip about whose tomatoes were finally coming in. The narrative softened because people chose practical work over dramatic rhetoric. Karen did not vanish. She watched from behind blinds for months and still offered an occasional snipe at the mailbox. But the neighbors no longer rallied when she roused. The HOA's actions and the city's citations had transformed her into a cautionary tale rather than a leader. The humiliation ate at her, which is to say it made her quieter and thinner at the edges. That was not my goal, but it was the inevitable arithmetic of consequences. The true payoff, for me, was less punitive and more life-affirming. The rain that once felt like a threat regained its simple character: water. My barrels filled. The garden drank. The strip of native plants we planted between our yards absorbed storms and taught anyone who would look the simple lesson: infrastructure beats outrage. When neighbor kids came to my yard to collect tadpoles after a heavy rain, I watched them without thinking about Karen. Watching those kids belly laugh in mud felt like the final punctuation in a sentence I had grown tired of rewriting. On the last day of remediation, Karen came to the fence. She wore work gloves and a tired expression, as though she had learned labor was a better substitute for performative outrage. She handed me a rusty trowel and said two small words that landed somewhere between confession and exhaustion: I messed up. It wasn't the apology of a hero, and it certainly wasn't sweeping, but it was a start. I accepted the trowel and planted a willow sapling with her, side by side, because completion matters more than the origin of contrition. It felt absurd to be planting a tree with someone who had waged war over rain, but it felt right. Trees outlast tantrums. The willow in that narrow strip between our yards grew into a small, patient thing that did more to repair soil than any HOA memo. Months later, when rain came heavy and honest, the neighborhood behaved like a neighborhood again. Kids jumped puddles. A dog shook off by the fence. An old man sold lemonade at a folding table on a street corner because why not? The strip of native plants hummed quietly, soaking up water, feeding pollinators, reminding us all that practical solutions are usually boring but effective. I will not pretend I learned to love conflict. I did learn to prefer the long game. Write down the facts. Involve neutral systems. Use rules, not rage. The romance of theatrical revenge is intoxicating, but it's ultimately poor infrastructure for a community. Passive competence wins because it outlasts shouting. Sometimes I still find a stray flyer in my mailbox, one of Karen's old manifestos, soggy at the edges. I keep them in a drawer ironically labeled evidence. Every now and then I take one out, smile at the memory, then recycle it. The rain keeps coming. The garden drinks it. The neighborhood moves on, and when I pass the strip of green between our yards, I water it and think about how small acts of stewardship can feel like revenge when they are patient and persistent. That felt like the win I wanted all along, and the rain finally felt gentle,